Hey guys, I'm Zoltan and you are watching PHLANSMINIATURES, and today we are going to be painting Radukar the Wolf and his undead bodyguard from Cursed City with my Contrast 3+2 method. A couple of weeks ago I uploaded a video about how I painted all the heroes from the Cursed City set with my Contrast method, which became quite popular. And since I only have a couple of models left from the set that I need to paint, mostly the villains, I thought that I would pick Radukar the Wolf, the main villain I suppose, and some of his zombie bodyguards, and use that opportunity to show you some of the things that were not mentioned in the previous video or give you more details about how the painting process actually works. But before jumping into this video, I would actually suggest to watch the first video here because they kind of complement each other. This one stands on its own, I suppose, but they go well together. That being said, let's jump in. As usual, we start from a zenital highlight. There's a couple of things to note here. First, the shadow color I used is not black, but a dark violet. I used some violet ink plus paint and sprayed it from below on a black primer. I do this because I think this makes the model a bit more visually interesting in the end, but also because I did this with the rest of the models in the set and I want to maintain the consistency with my previous paint jobs. You can simply use a black primer if you don't want to go fancy, or if you already had a black primer on your other Cursed City models. The other thing, which is probably more interesting to note, is how much white I use on the zenital highlights. I usually don't go crazy on the brightness of my zenital, since I mostly use it to give me a rough idea where the light should be, but since we'll be painting with contrast paints, we will need a bright undercoat, so the paints show their colors and maintain their vibrancy. So don't be afraid to spray a bit more white and only leave the violet or black in the deepest shadows. You can dial the brightness of the model up or down with the amount of white you use, and I used a bit less here than on the heroes since these are the bad guys after all. One tip here is that if you are using an airbrush instead of a rattle can to apply the zenital, you can use the extra control it gives you to emphasize some of the areas more, meaning that you can spray a bit more white on some of the more prominent parts of the model, especially when they face towards the light and if they will be more visible in the end. Doing this, you can already sketch out the most visually interesting parts of the model, and if you pay attention, you will be able to see how this shows up on the leg and the chest of Radukar on the final result. This is probably the most straightforward part of the painting process. I select a scheme for the models, which in this case is as close to the box art as I can get, with some artistic license here and there. And then I try to find the best contrast paints to match the scheme. Sometimes it's a really easy match, and you simply have the perfect paint to achieve the right color, but sometimes it can be a bit tricky to find the right one. When this happens, you can find a slightly different color and claim artistic license, of course, keeping in mind that altering the colors a lot can really change how the scheme will look in the end. And we don't generally want to end up with a mini that looks like a clown, unless that is what we're going for, of course. The other option is to alter some of the colors to get what we need. For example, for the coat of the zombies, I simply couldn't find the right tone, so I ended up mixing an orange, a brown and a red contrast paint together to get a rough match. I didn't really manage to dial it in perfectly, but I liked the tone and it was different enough from the red that I used on the pants of Radukar. You can also dilute the paints a bit with either contrast medium or just a bit of water to get a different result. This is especially helpful when you have the right tone, but the coverage of the contrast paint you are using is too high. This can be a bit of a trial and error until you get to know the paints, but once you use them a couple of times, you will mostly know what to expect. For example, on the wolf pelt around Radukar's shoulder, I wanted to have a light greyish pelt, something that has more contrast than the original box art, but still reads like a relatively light color. So I used Basilicanum Grey heavily diluted with contrast medium, so the upper surfaces remain mostly white, but it created a bit of transition below and stained the crevices darker. If I just used Basilicanum Grey out of the pot, the whole pelt would have turned completely grey with almost black shadows. One thing I pay attention to whenever I use contrast is that when I apply it, I use generous amounts. It works very differently from normal paint, so don't even try for the two thin coats approach. All the work we did with the zenital highlight before means that we can cover everything fully in a single pass of the brush without the need to apply another layer. The already existing shadow areas from the zenital mean that there will be a natural transition from light to dark, and the shadows will be more pronounced than with just a white or a grey undercoat. That being said, the biggest issue with contrast is the fact that it creates blotches, dark patches on larger flat surfaces, and it also tends to pool and create unnaturally dark coffee stains in the crevices. This can be fully solved in my experience, but you can make it much less prominent if you pay attention to how you apply it. There is a small window after the paint is applied, but before it starts drying, where you can offload your brush, dry it on a paper towel, and with the empty brush you can go back and soak up some of the extra paint that is pooling in the wrong places. You just have to be careful not to soak up too much, because if you soak up all the paint from the crevices and deep areas of the model, you will lose the contrast effect of the paint, and with that, the point of using it. Another reason for applying generous amounts of paint is to make sure that it reaches all the nooks and crannies of the model. It is very easy to get caught up in the speed painting madness that contrast allows you to do and leave some parts of the model unpainted, especially behind some edges and harder to reach areas. After the contrast stage is finished, these will be hard to fix and will soak up more of your time that you could be using for the next steps. So make sure that you turn the model around, look behind those details and edges, and make sure that everything is painted so you don't have to worry about it later. Once we are done with the contrast paints, it's time to finish with the metals. As I already explained in the first video, it is better to leave this step for last, since the metal pigments tend to go everywhere and you can end up having sparkling little dots on the rest of the model if you don't change your paint water. You can use any metal paints here, but especially for the villains, I would suggest something that is a bit on the darker side, since if you go super bright, it will be harder to shade it down. It probably goes without saying, but try not to touch the already painted parts with this, since unlike normal paints, these are much harder to wipe away with a damp brush. You will end up with glittering specks everywhere, so this is the part where you need to be a bit more precise than with the contrasts. Steady your hand by putting both of your elbows on the table and rest the wrist of your painting hand on the hand holding the mini. This way, by moving your fingers with the brush only, you can stabilize the brush enough to hit exactly what you need to hit with those pesky metal pigments. Depending on how bright the paint you are using is, it is also worth adding a quick and generous shade on top of it. Something dark like Nuln oil, for example, since the oil wash we will apply next probably won't be enough to darken it enough, plus more definition never hurts. A useful tip to make things even faster is that you can simply go for a silver or gunmetal color for every metal part and not bother with a separate gold at all, since you can turn any metallic silver into gold by painting over it with some contrast paints. I found Aggaros Dunes works really well for this, as you can see here on Radukar's ornaments. This is a very simple but crucial step in the process, but it also led to lots of questions in the comments of the last video. There are several reasons why I'm using an oil wash. First of all, I use it to add more definition to the model. Contrast paints provide some contrast, but not nearly enough in my opinion. That is why we pre-shade with the zenithal highlight and why we shade it further with the wash. So essentially we do 3 shading steps: the shadows of the zenithal, the contrast effect of the paints, and the oil wash. But I can already hear the thought forming in your heads, yeah, but why not just use a normal acrylic wash? The answer is that washes, if applied over the whole model, will taint the whole surface and make everything way darker and messier. That is why in the traditional Games Workshop style of painting, they advise you to paint most of the surface again with the original color after the shading step. Since we want to go for speed here, we don't really want to introduce another lengthy step, and that is where the simple oil wash comes in. With this, we can control how dark we want the model to be by removing more or less of the wash and avoid adding extra stains and blotches. We had enough of those with the contrast and we don't need more to fix. The wash can be simply removed from any surfaces we don't want it to stain by wiping it away with a brush or a sponge, which is super simple and barely takes any time, especially compared to painting 90% of the model again. It looks very scary at first glance, but it is actually quite easy to do and super fast. All you need is some brown and black oil paints. Mix them together more or less equally or with a bit more brown than black, and then add some white spirit to it. You can see that the mix I have here is quite diluted. The consistency is slightly thicker than water. We simply slather the whole model with it generously. Notice how the paint immediately runs into the crevices almost completely by itself. This is one of the advantages of using oils. No need to be precise with the first application. It's actually better to add more than less, since after we applied it on the whole model, we can simply go back with an empty brush and soak up the excess amounts wherever it's pooling too much. You don't have to worry about disturbing the paint like with the contrast, since oil paints dry extremely slowly, which we can take advantage of. Once we are satisfied with the result, meaning that the whole model is nicely covered in dark oil paint, we can wait a couple of hours and let it dry. If you are painting a big batch of models, by the time you are done applying the wash on the last model, you can start removing it from the first one. The more you wait, the more the oil is going to dry and the less you will remove by simply wiping it away with a dry sponge, and the darker the paint job will end up in general. Since I wanted to go for a darker end result for the villains, I waited a bit longer than usual before starting the removal stage. In case you left them a bit too long, don't worry too much. You can simply put some white spirit on your sponge or brush and the oil will come off easily. Ideally, at this point, you take a break and let the models sit overnight so the wash can dry properly. I changed this step from the last video and added the highlights before the varnishing step, since this time I wanted to make sure that the highlight colors are also included in the varnish and we get the same matte finish as the rest of the model. Since we are doing a speed painting session, I tried to keep my highlighting quite basic even compared to the heroes, since I felt those deserved a bit more bling than the baddies. I only used 2 highlight colors plus 1 metal highlight for the bodyguards and a couple more for Redukar himself. I went for mostly just edge highlights in the most prominent areas to make sure that the details of the model are as readable as possible. Normally, this is achieved in combination with recess shading and highlighting the model to provide contrast between the shadows and the highlights, but all the previous steps already made sure that all the recesses are dark and there is some color transitions from dark to light thanks to the contrast. So all we need to do at this point is to highlight all the edges to properly differentiate the details of the model. Since our goal is a good balance between speed and quality, I'm using highlights that are brighter than what I would use for my initial highlight if I painted normally, but not as bright as my final highlight would be. Ultimately, it is up to you how much extra work you want to put in here, but my clock was ticking at this point since I wanted to be done with this entire project in less than 1 afternoon's worth of painting split into 2 sessions. As I said in the previous step, I decided to change the order from the last video and move this to the last step since I wanted to apply it with a brush instead of an airbrush and show you how you can apply the varnish selectively without hitting the metal parts. Usually I don't bother with excluding the metals from the varnishing step since I like the more burnished look it gives them, but you might have a different preference or not have an airbrush. Something to note here is that I'm not using the varnish to protect the model, that is just an added benefit. The idea is to knock back the glossy finish of the model that comes from both the contrast paints and the oil wash. This is also the reason why I don't do this before the washing stage. The varnish is not really needed at that point. Citadel Contrast paints don't reactivate with the oil at all, and they withstand the wiping step as well without issues. However, if I did the varnish before the wash, the oil paint would bring back the glossy finish that I wanted to get rid of and defeat the whole point. I think that a matte finish on models just simply looks better than the glossy one, and if you don't believe me, try it out for yourself. If after that you still like the glossy finish, then whatever floats your boat, I guess, but obviously you're wrong. Once we are done with this step, all that remains is to add some extra base decorations and do the most essential and satisfying part of any painting session, painting the base rims black. And here is the final result. And that's it for this video. Don't forget to like it if you enjoyed it. It really helps the channel and my mood if you do. Subscribe if you would like to see some more content from me in the future, and see you in the next one.